Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Justin Belko, and today I'm moderating for our speaker, Mark Bukutzi. Mark is a researcher, activist, artist, and educator working at the intersection of technology, social change, and consciousness research. His goal is to normalize psychic and afterlife-related experiences in order to create a more compassionate, sustainable, and interconnected world. He's the executive director of the Winbridge Research Center, a public charity dedicated to easing suffering around death, dying, and what comes next through rigorous scientific research and the publication of free science-based educational materials. He has been awarded multiple competitive research grants to support his work with mental and physical mediums, technologies facilitating after-death communication experiences, psychokinesis, and precognition. Will now be presenting his work.
Mediumship research and overview. My name is Mark Bukutzi, and I will be your guide for today. Okay, so there's some housekeeping notices. I do mention various products, services, mostly books, things like that. I don't receive any endorsements for those products or services that are mentioned. Comments made about products or services are based on my own experiences. Your experiences may differ. I will be talking about things about health and healthcare. I am not a healthcare provider. Do not take healthcare advice from me, and always check with your healthcare provider when considering treatment options or making lifestyle changes. I'm declaring fair use on this video. There are some items in here which are not being cleared for copyright, but since this is for educational use, I am declaring those items pilfered under fair use. If you use this video for any other purpose, you will be required to clear those copyrights. Okay, now with all that stuff out of the way. Hello from Tucson, Arizona. I'm Mark Bukutzi, where I live with my wife and research partner, Julie Beischel, and our two dogs, Toggle and Ada Grace. And I mention the dogs because I am at home today, and there's a very strong possibility that two dogs may come and attack me at any moment, but we'll try to keep them at bay. Okay, so just a little bit about me really quickly. In 2008, Julie and I co-founded the Winbridge Institute, which was originally a platform for Julie and I to conduct mediumship and afterlife research, but we retooled it in 2017, and we moved the afterlife research into the Winbridge Research Center, which is a nonprofit organization with the mission of studying dying, death, and what comes next. The Institute's still around. We focus primarily on applied Psi research. And in 2019, I started a project called the Parapsychology Psi Hacking Project, which is an effort to bring makers, artists, entrepreneurs, and Psi researchers together in order to create more public-facing installations and engage people with the field. I am a full member of the Society for Scientific Exploration. I am also a full member, a professional member of the Parapsychological Association. My research has been published in various journals, and I'm also, as John mentioned, an instructor at the Ryan Education Center. I just recently finished an Introduction to Parapsychology class, and I taught art and parapsychology last year. So I know we've been through some definitions, and with the previous talks, Annalisa did a really wonderful job laying out sort of the lay of the land, and Christine Simmons-Moore is always wonderful to hear her lecture and speak on her topics. But I kind of feel the need to sort of do a quick hit just to make sure everyone's on the same page in terms of terminology. And terminology in this field can actually be really difficult. It tends to be a little bit of a moving target. So I'm going to make my best effort at moving you through this material. I also promise that this entire presentation will not be a set of bullet point lists, but you are going to see a couple of slides of those right out of the gate. So here we go, a few quick definitions. A discarnate is a survived consciousness that exists separate from a deceased physical body. You'll hear me use these terms a lot. A medium is someone who regularly experiences communication with discarnates. People can have mediumistic experiences, but that does not necessarily make them a medium. Mediumship is the process of receiving messages from a discarnate and conveying those messages to the living. And that whole process is very important. A sitter is a living person who wants to hear from a discarnate through a medium. And a reading is the event during which a medium contacts a discarnate on behalf of a sitter and assists in their communication. A psychic is a living person who regularly retrieves information about the living, the past, the future, out to other locations, etc. Okay, just a few quick definitions, I promise. And some of these you probably already heard, but we're going to go through them. Psi, or the Greek letter psi, pronounced psi, is an umbrella term for certain types of psychic functioning, including telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, and psychokinesis. Postmortem survival refers to the idea that some aspect of consciousness survives the death of the body. It's also known as survival of bodily death, the survival hypothesis, or simply survival. It covers a wide range of phenomena. Like Annalisa said, there's mediumship, reincarnation, near-death experiences, ghosts and hauntings and apparitions, and more. I want to do a little bit of a deep dive on the survival hypothesis definition from the parapsychological perspective. And this is from the Irwin and Watt book, Introduction to Parapsychology. It's kind of the classic textbook these days for parapsychology. So I'm just going to read this quote really quick. The survival hypothesis concerns the notion of postmortem survival, that is, that a disembodied consciousness or some such discarnate element of human personality might survive bodily death, at least for a time. The survival hypothesis has obvious religious connotations, but these are of no concern in scientific parapsychology. And I think this is one of the things that makes studying mediumship really, really difficult. It's that the concept and the idea of mediumship and connection with ancestors and life after death is so entrenched in so many different cultures and religion and societies and families that even when you start to sort of look at it in any kind of critical way, especially when you're dealing with research participants that are living these experiences, it becomes really touchy and really, really tricky. It's a tricky space to navigate. And so we'll talk more about that. Okay, so just finishing up these definitions, we talked about postmortem survival, and then parapsychology is the scientific study of psi and survival. Okay, I am now done with bullet point lists for the most part. So ever since the beginning of recorded history and people have walked around and looked up at the sky, they wanted to connect with these forces that seem bigger than us. So they wanted to be able to heal the sick or predict the future or change the future or connect with the dead or their ancestors. And as I was saying, this idea of connecting with ancestors or connecting with the dead or communing with the dead or speaking to the dead is pervasive around the world. And I don't study around the world, unfortunately. There are many research organizations that are based all over the world that are doing all sorts of interesting psi research and afterlife research. And if you're interested in knowing more about the individual cultures and how different cultures interact with the afterlife or ancestors, I would highly recommend this book edited by Jack Hunter and David Luke called Talking with Spirits. But for me right now, I'm going to stay here in my little corner of Arizona, where the Winbridge Research Center is located. And our primary population of interest is modern American secular mental mediums. And I'm going to stay in my lane for this conversation. And what we learn about this population can spread out to other populations, but I don't want to imply that everything that's happening here automatically applies to everyone everywhere. So I think it's really important to talk a little bit about history of parapsychology and its relation to mediumship before we dive into mediumship. And this is a tool that I love to use all the time. It's Google's Google Books Ngram Viewer. And what I've tracked here are 3 topics, and it's spiritualism, parapsychology, and psychical research. And what this tool does is it gives a sense of how often these terms appear in print over time. And so this is a date range from the year 1800 to 2019. And you can track each one of these lines and see how things sort of become more popular or less popular. And I think it's a really interesting metric. So most parapsychologists will point to the year 1884 and the Fox sisters as sort of the birthplace of mediumship, modern mediumship, or sort of the start of what we would consider to be modern mediumship research. And the Fox sisters lived in upstate New York, and they reported all kinds of interesting phenomena. They were hearing thumps and bangs, and it was all attributed to discarnate communication and spirits. And they became very popular. And it's this sort of event, their exposure really, many people believe, was the catalyst in kicking off the spiritualism movement in the US and in the UK. So as those movements began to grow, not only individuals, people off the street were interested in them, but scientists started to take notice as well. And so in 1882, the Society for Psychical Research was formed in London, and the SPR is still around today. Excuse me. And someone mentioned their Psi Encyclopedia. It's excellent. They have a great journal. Go check out their website. They have really cool stuff. But they were effectively, in my opinion, were the real first organization that started looking at mediumship and really psychic phenomena in general in a very systematic way. Shortly after the foundation of the SPR, the American Society for Psychical Research was founded in Boston in 1885. And pretty sure it's Boston. Yeah, Boston. And the SPR still exists in some way or another, but their status is a little questionable. So you could look them up on the Psi Encyclopedia and get more about their backstory. But these 2 organizations and other researchers around the world pretty much drove the mediumship and psychic research up until about 1930s, up until around the 1930s, where you see where J.B. Rhine, who's been mentioned a few times now, came to Duke University, and the J.B. Rhine Duke Parapsychology Lab was formed. And what's interesting about J.B. Rhine and his wife Louisa is that they not only, excuse me, I'm totally frogging my throat. Thank you. Sorry, one more time. Okay. The interesting thing about Duke, or J.B. Rhine, was that he introduced from the German the term parapsychology and really restructured the research into a different paradigm. So while pretty much everyone else at the time was involved with mediumship one way or another, Rhine said, no, we're not gonna do mediums. We're gonna avoid any scandals or accusations of fraud. There was a lot of fraud being reported at that time, and potentially untoward activity with various mediums, and Rhine didn't want to get involved with any of that stuff, and rightfully so. And there was another fundamental logical problem that he faced, which is this idea of telepathy with the living versus spirit communication. And I'm going to dig into that just a little bit. So what we mean here is that we have a medium, and we have a sitter, and we have a discarnate. And the sitter, in this very overly simplified example, will ask the medium, well, tell me something about my deceased mother. And the discarnate, who's the deceased mother, says, oh, my name's Karen. The medium uses psi, or telepathy, mind-to-mind communication, to retrieve that information from the discarnate. Or receive reception, sorry, AI. So receive the information from the discarnate, sorry. So then the medium might say something, was your mom's name Karen? The sitter would then find that evidential, and there would be a connection made, and the reading could progress sort of like that. This idea of using telepathy to communicate with discarnates is called survival psi, and it's a term coined by Michael Sudduth a few years ago. However, there's an alternative explanation for what's happening here. So same setup, medium, sitter, discarnate. Sitter says, tell me about my mother, but the sitter knows the name of her mother. So the medium doesn't use telepathy to contact the discarnate. The medium gets the information directly from the sitter. And this could happen through any number of psi modalities. But then the medium would say, oh, was your mother's name Karen? And the sitter would take that as evidential. And however, in this scenario, there's still parapsychology happening, there's still psi happening, there's still technology or telepathy happening, but there's no need for a discarnate in this model. And this form of psi is called somatic psi. It's also sometimes called super psi or living agent psi. We're moving away from those terms. They're not particularly accurate. And this was a term coined by Beischel and Rock a few years ago as well. So we have somatic psi and survival psi. And the problem with these two alternative hypotheses is that up until very recently, there was no way to break the tie to decide where the information was coming from. And there was no way methodologically to do that. And people thought about that for a really, really long time. And it is still heavily debated in the field as to whether or not we can ever truly break this tie between survival psi and somatic psi. So at that point, mediumship research didn't die or go away 100%, but it sort of got relegated to the back room. And Rhine then decided, and other researchers decided to focus on topics that were more easily testable in the lab. And so even as early as 2005, the late William Broad, who was a fundamental researcher in our field and wrote this amazing book called Distant Mental Influence, was quoted saying, today, psi research restricts itself almost exclusively to the big four phenomena of telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, and psychokinesis, with the occasional nod towards survival and afterlife topics. Now, I remember I first got involved in parapsychology in 2005, and through the Rhine Research Center's summer study program in parapsychology. And I remember talking to the instructors there and saying, well, survival. And a number of people were like, don't do it. Survival is not an area that you're going to get funding. It's not anything that people take seriously. And I think that that's funny today. So just as a aside here, so here's our timeline, and here we're tracking mediumship, right? And we see it sort of ebbs and flows. But by 2005, where this occasional nod comment was made, we already start to see this interesting spike in materials related to mediumship. And so around early 2000s, there was this sort of public shift in interest in survival topics. And so this is something I personally call the survival revival. No one ever calls it that, but I'm trying to make it stick. And for me, the really interesting bits happened with Tricia Robertson and Archie Roy, who published 2 papers looking at using a double-blind procedure for assessing the relevance of a medium's statements to a recipient. So how could they look at mediumship accuracy? And then they followed up with another paper in 2004. So right around this time as well, academics were writing some interesting books about the afterlife and mediumship. There was this explosion of television shows. And so all this was sort of building up over the course of the next few years. For me, the next big milestone was my wife and research partner, Julie Beischel, co-authored a paper with Dr. Gary Schwartz at the University of Arizona, entitled Anomalous Information Reception by Research Mediums Demonstrating a Novel Triple-Blind Protocol. And that paper, in my opinion, really set the bar for how people would start to approach accuracy testing of mediums. In 2008, Julie and I formed the Winbridge Institute, and Julie published a paper called Contemporary Methods Used in Laboratory-Based Mediumship Research. And this paper outlines the protocol and how to pre-screen mediums, which we'll talk about in a minute, and really lays out the entire research program. But for me, things really changed in 2009 when Julie, Adam Rock, myself, and another researcher named Mike Piso received a BL Foundation Award. This is a granting organization based in Portugal, and they actually paid us to do mediumship research. And when people saw that we were getting funded, a number of people came out of the woodwork and were like, I've always wanted to do mediumship research, but I was always scared of the pushback or and if you guys are getting funded, can we talk about it? And that to me was a big change in the way parapsychology started to think about mediumship and afterlife topics. 2016, the Institute that reorganized into the center the next year. So this is really interesting. So in 2016, the PA-SSE meeting, this was the last time the PA-SSE meeting happened, a joint meeting. And if you go back to the program for that meeting, you can see that there were literally 3 topics under the mediumship and survival grouping in that. So one was on experimental table tipping. One was on the spiritually transformative experiences of claimant mediums. And what's interesting here is that Bill Everest, actually, I sponsored him to be in that meeting, and he was actually a Winbridge volunteer. And Julie, Dr. Julie Beischel, presenting a comprehensive survey of secular American mediums. And that was it. So I'm not saying like this was the only research, the only afterlife and mediumship research going on in the world at the time, but this was the only research being represented at basically the 2 largest conferences in the US that would support this work. Jump ahead to 2021, and the field has gotten a much broader. If you go through the program today, you're going to see a lot more people presenting about different aspects of mediumship and afterlife and after-death communication experiences. And so this is really great. And I think this shows that I think finally these topics have sort of eked their way out of the dark little corners, and parapsychology is giving more than just the occasional nod now to these topics. So just a quick thing, I'll just fly through this really quick. So you can see, again, we're tracking parapsychology, we're tracking mediumship. And I think this is a nice little metaphor, or, of where the fields sort of are melding and coming together currently, and then the survival revival. Okay, so let's actually dig in and start talking about some research. So I'm going to talk about modern research as it's happening over the last few years, especially through the lens of the Winbridge Research Center. And there's a couple of areas I want to talk about, and then we'll go a little bit deeper. It'll be like an onion. So the first thing I want to talk about is population. Who are the people that we work with? I want to talk about our research approach, and I want to talk about results. So our population, as I mentioned, is made up of mediums, and mediums generally come in 2 broad yet overlapping flavors or abilities or interests or styles. One is called mental mediumship, which I've been talking about, and a mental mediumship is a person that conveys spoken messages from deceased animals or people, known as discarnates, to living people sitter during a specific event known as a reading. A physical medium, however, facilitates the creation of independent voices, paranormal lights, apports, which are objects that seem to appear out of nowhere, levitation or movement of objects, ectoplasm, which is a material that seems to extrude from the medium's body, sounds, raps, and other physical phenomena. This is generally put under the label of macro psychokinesis or macro PK effects. Now at Winbridge, we've studied physical mediumship just a little bit. We received a very generous grant from the PA's Gilbert Rollers Fund back in 2013. And we did some work with table tipping and other kinds of phenomena. And physical mediumship isn't as popular in the US as it is in other places. And so the majority of mediums that we're going to run into are mental mediums. So we're refocused on that. If you're interested in learning more about physical mediumship, I would recommend Leslie Kane's book, Surviving Death. She's got some interesting chapters in there. Okay, so we work with mental mediums. Again, modern American secular mental mediums. They're the most common mediums in the US. But what's interesting about the mediums we work with is that they not only give readings where they connect with deceased people, but they also give psychic readings for the living, right? So as we mentioned, a psychic can get information about or from living people, distant locations or events, and or times in the future or in the past. So this brings up a really interesting point, which if you have a takeaway from today, this is a takeaway I'd like you to take, I'd like you to bring with you, is that all mediums are psychic, but not all psychics are mediums. Okay, so one of the things that is very important in parapsychology research in general, and what we do is we work with a pre-screened set of participants, right? So when we're looking to test a specific phenomena, we want to know that the people that we're working with can actually do the task that we're asking them to do. Otherwise, it's a big waste of time and money and effort, and no one's happy. So we go through a process of pre-screening, and our process results in individuals who become Winbridge certified research mediums, or WCRMs. And each WCRM has to go through an 8-step process that includes interviews and blinded or masked readings over the phone, and tests and training and all kinds of stuff. Can take months up to a year to move a WCRM through the training process, the training and certification process. Before anybody asks, we are not doing WCRM certification anymore. The program is closed. We may start it up in the future, but we have no plans to do that at the moment. But what we've ended up with is a population of these pre-screened, pre-trained Winbridge certified research mediums who can perform, who are science-minded, can follow directions, follow protocol, and can produce these effects as we require them. So we also work with sitters. So in order to get the most optimized experience from our sitters, we train them as well. So we train them in our accuracy scoring system. They're trained in experimental procedures, and they must successfully score a test reading before they're allowed into the program. So that's sort of an overview of our population. So I want to talk a little bit about our research approach. And this might sound a little preachy, but I'm very passionate about this topic, and I have strong opinions about how research in this area should work. So one of the driving forces at Winbridge is that you can do it fast or you can do it right. And so there's always an interest in optimizing and reducing costs and running as many participants as possible. And all that's really important, especially in a field like parapsychology, where resources are really thin. We try not to fall into that trap. We would rather do a large, complicated study that covers all the bases and does everything right than push through and just try to be a publication machine or just collect data for data's sake. And I'm not saying that everyone does that, but it's an easy trap to fall into, especially for a small organization like us that has limited resources. You need to study the phenomena as it is, not how we want it to be. So we need to look at the phenomenology or the experience of the phenomena and then design experiments accordingly. Again, there's an easy trap to be like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if you get a medium and you can put her in a bag and then throw her in a lake and then see if she can read something. Like, that's not the way mediumship works, right? We have sitters, we have mediums, we have verbal messages, we have, right? So stay within the scope of the reported phenomena. Otherwise, you're probably studying something that's not mediumship. You want to optimize your conditions for success. Now, this seems like it might be cheating a little bit in science, but it's really not. So, for example, if I get some seeds and I put them on my counter and I deny them light and water and soil, and I come back the next day and they're just still seeds, and I yell at them and call them frauds and say that they're not, how dare you call yourself seeds? That's really poor science, right? In order for these seeds to germinate, they need to have the optimal conditions, right? They need temperature and possibly water and soil and maybe even light. And then we can see whether or not they're frauds. But if I don't give them the materials and resources that they need, we can never experience the phenomena. And the same thing goes with mediumship research. So again, we use pre-screened participants, carefully pre-screened participants. We ensure the experiment fits the phenomena. We match the lived experience of the sitters and the mediums with the experiments that we're trying to run. It's very important, in my opinion, to protect participants even from themselves. There's a tendency this is, like I was mentioning, this is a tough field. So a lot of times you may be dealing with sitters who are deeply grieving. And so they may be wanting a mediumship reading to help alleviate that grief, but you have to really be careful because you're not providing a treatment, you're performing an experiment. And depending on how that experiment goes, you could really end up hurting people. And so just because your ethics committee says, oh yeah, sure, you should do this thing, you could do this thing, doesn't necessarily mean you should. And the other thing too is that there are people who are just really passionate about this and will do anything just to do it because they want to learn and they want to explain. So they may take risks in participating in various types of research that if it was for a different topic or a different thing, they might not do. Or there's also this idea that if certain practitioners can be validated by a research lab, it helps. It provides them with an opportunity to make more money, right? Because there are some very, very successful mediums out there that have been validated by various labs, and so again, these people might be willing to take risks that might not normally take. And I feel like as research scientists, we have an extra responsibility to protect those participants. We also consider discarnate motivation, right? So that's why we always connect a sitter to the experiment, right? Because let's say there's a discarnate, like, I don't know, some famous dead person, Marilyn Monroe. And I'm like, hey, medium, go talk to Marilyn Monroe. Well, why would Marilyn Monroe want to talk to me? I'm certainly not that interesting and we have no kind of connection. But if I'm like, hey, could you contact my dead mother who died, last year? There's a personal connection there, and that my mother may actually want to come through and speak to me through a medium. So this idea of connection, personal connection, and pairing making sure the discarnate has a reason to participate in research is really important. And because I can't think of anything more boring than being dead and then like having to answer a bunch of questions through a medium to a research scientist. It's a terrible afterlife. We also want to maximize experimental control. So we're optimizing for success, but we're making sure that our experiments are properly masked with blinding, have proper randomization, statistics, all the important sciencey stuff that makes an experiment valid. Okay, so that's population, that's research approach. Now let's talk about results. So in our research, we look at 3 separate arms. And the first one I'm going to talk about, all of them, and then we'll do a deep dive into each one. So the first one is what we call the information research arm. And the primary question we're trying to answer here is, can mediums really report accurate and specific information about the dead? The next is what we call the operations arm. And Christine Simmons-Moore hinted at these various proof-focused, process-focused types of research. We use slightly different nomenclature, but it's basically the same thing. So operations research, can mediums provide insight into the survival hypothesis and the nature of consciousness? Can we learn more about this relationship between mind and brain through our study of mediums and mediumship? And then finally, we're very interested in applications research. All this stuff is great and wonderful, and we need to learn it, but how does this help people? At the end of the day, we want to alleviate suffering, right? And we see that mediumship communication and after-death communication and these kinds of interactions ultimately can help people who are suffering. So let's look at the information research arm really quick. So in order to assess the accuracy of a medium statement, it's actually really difficult. There's a lot of moving parts and there's a lot of things that have to be considered. So you need a very carefully controlled experiment or protocol that lets you collect and analyze those data in meaningful ways, right? So again, it's got to match the experiences of the medium. It's got to be optimized for success, while also have fit validity to the, that's a term I use. It's got to fit the phenomenology. It's got to be scientifically valid. And it has to properly control for lots of things, including fraud, which is something that a lot of other areas of research don't necessarily have to control for. Like there aren't too many people going into a drug trial going, hey, I'm going to fake out the drug trial today. So I want to talk again just a little bit about the structure of a typical reading, right? So we have our discarnate, says I'm a survived personality without a body. We have a mental medium. I experience regular communication with discarnates and then provide messages to the sitters. And then there's sitters who would like to communicate with the departed loved one. And so there's a connection between the sitter and the discarnate. Now, what's really important here is that with any type of human communication or any human endeavor, basically people have to get along. So there needs to be some sort of working relationship between the discarnate, the mental medium, and the sitter, or the reading itself is probably going to go south. And this dynamic is something that we're very interested in learning more about, but it definitely seems to exist, and it can definitely impact the quality of a reading. So again, what's the medium's experience of a reading? So again, we have the sitter, they ask a question, the discarnate provides an answer. There's a telepathic connection between the medium and the discarnate. There's a response, a verbal response, and that verbal response is transmitted some way, shape, or form, maybe over the phone these days, or over Skype, or just spoken to the sitter. And then there's this personal connection that's made. Okay, so if we want a controlled experiment that covers all these bases, that lets us collect the data in a meaningful way about mediumship accuracy, where do we find that? Well, fortunately, one's been published. In 2007, as I mentioned, Julie published this paper, Contemporary Methods Used in Laboratory-Based Mediumship, and it is some have called it the gold standard of mediumship accuracy testing. Other people have not been as enthusiastic about it for various reasons, but that's just the nature of science. Everything is a debate. And but however, in my opinion and in the opinion of others, the protocols laid out here are pretty solid. It is a fully masked reading protocol, which means there are multiple levels of blinding. So fully masked means that the information is carefully compartmentalized to prevent information leakage that could impact what the medium says, or how the experimenters interact with the sitters, or how the sitter interprets and scores their reading for accuracy. So a fully masked quintuple, I can never say the word, 5 levels of blinding, protocol addresses the normal explanations for the source of a medium's accurate readings. Using this protocol, we collected accuracy data from 58 readings performed by 20 pre-screened mediums. Some of the features or highlights of this protocol is that all the readings are done over the phone. No one is ever in the same room. So it reduces the possibility of various kinds of information leakage. We use what's called a blinded proxy sitter. So one of the mediums is the experimenter who's on the phone with the medium knows nothing about the discarnate, has no details about the discarnate, and the medium never interacts directly with the sitter. The sitters score blinded targets and decoy readings. So once the reading is over, the sitter will receive 2 readings. One of them is theirs and the other one is a decoy. They don't know which one is which. They're asked to score both of them and return them. This deals with things like rater bias, and which can influence how a person rates a particular reading when they know it's for them. So if a person tends to rate things hard, they'll probably rate both readings hard, or if they're easygoing, they would be consistent in that. We ask specific questions of the medium. We need to know things like cause of death, hobbies, and physical description of the discarnate. We also provide a chance for discarnate motivation and allow the medium to provide just open-ended messages to the sitter. The protocol requires 3 experimenters to ensure proper compartmentalization of all the data, and the sitters score readings. The sitters score the readings, and that's because no one else is qualified to score that information. Because in a typical mediumship reading, the information can come through as inside jokes or symbols or signs or stories that would be impossible for an individual to convey their life history to a third independent party to judge and determine the accuracy of any particular statements. So it's imperative that the sitters score their own readings. They just need to do it in a way that's controlled, that doesn't have information leakage and controls for rater bias. And we look at different kinds of scoring. So when a reading comes through, it's itemized. So we look at item by item scoring. We look at the whole score. We ask the sitters to give a score for the entire reading. And then we ask them to do forced choice, which was mentioned in an earlier talk, where you have 2 choices and you have to make one or the other. And in this case, we make them do the forced choice between the decoy and the target. They have to pick one. They don't know which one is which. And then we run the stats and report all those data. This protocol is long and complicated because it needs to be, because if you skimp on any of the pieces, you will break it and things will become unblinded, or there will be information leakage, or there will be some sort of bias built into the system. So Julie has created this video. It's about 25 minutes, 20 minutes or so, that gives an overview of the actual protocol in more detail. And it's up on YouTube, and I made a little tiny URL. So it's tinyurl/WRC AIR, Winbridge Research Center Anomalous Information Reception. So I'll leave that there for another second, do some screen grabs, take a picture. It's going away, 3, 2, 1. Okay. So what do we find when we look at all those data? Well, for accuracy, right, when we look at when the blinded sitters score their readings, we find that the readings that are intended for them, their item by item scores are higher, and they score their item by item scores more accurate than the decoy. The overall scores that they give to their readings are higher in the actual targets than in the decoys. And in the forced choice, they pick their own reading more than would be considered by chance. Again, all these results are statistically significant. So it's one thing when one lab does it and we see evidence for this ability of anomalous information reception or the reporting of accurate and specific information for mediums, but it's better when more labs do it. And so one of the ways we look at disparate or not disparate, but similar studies from different places, like Annalisa mentioned, is a thing called a meta-analyses. And again, they have pros and cons, but this is a recent meta-analyses run by Patrizio Tresoldi and his team. And they looked at anomalous information reception specifically by mediums. And what they concluded was the results indicate that some mediums can anomalously receive information about deceased persons. I would have said that backwards. So can mediums really report accurate and specific information about the dead? Yes. Yes, they can. Now, that's a hard line, and I'm sure there's a bunch of people out there rolling their eyes and being upset about that answer, but, you know, there's only so much data you can collect. Hi. So does that actually answer the survival question? No, it doesn't. Just because we have accurate information, we still don't know where it comes from. So information, good. Operation, can mediums provide insight into the survival hypothesis? So again, we come back to this source of Psi problem, or this survival Psi versus somatic Psi blockage or headway or impasse. That's the word. So in our operations research, we look at phenomenology, which is the experience of both the sitters and the mediums, and the physiology of the mediums. So what's going on in their bodies, what's going on in their brains. We also look at their psychology. I don't have time to talk about psychology today, and I kind of feel like I might not even have time to talk about these other things, but I'm going to burn through. We're going to start with physiology, and we're going to talk about brains, because everyone's like, oh, brains, it's so sciencey. So back in the oldie days of 2013, researchers from the Institute of Noetic Sciences, the Winbridge Institute, and UC San Diego got together, and we ran a study that looked at the neural correlates associated with subjective experiences of communication with the deceased, right? So what's going on in a medium's brain when they perform a mediumship reading? And for this study, the study was actually conducted at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. They have a really great EEG setup, and we have mediums, and then there was a lot of collaboration on the protocol. So our Wakurims were used in this study. So basically, in one part of the study, we asked the mediums to remember a story, listen to a story, fabricate a story about a deceased person, and then actually perform communication, get in touch with a deceased person of their choice. And when we look at the EEG for those data, for those different phenomena, they look different. So the paper concludes, the study finding suggests that the experience of communicating with the deceased may be a distinct mental state that is not consistent with brain activity during ordinary thinking or imagination. So this is very important. This shows that Psi is happening in the brain, and it's different than making stuff up or lying or recalling something that you had read earlier. So does this get us to survival? Nope, not quite yet. We're getting close, but not yet. What we would need to do in order to think more about the survival question is to compare the EEG or brain activity of survival Psi to the brain activity of somatic Psi. However, that might not actually work, because Psi is Psi. It's all telepathy, right? It's all whatever's going on in there. So Psi in the brain probably all looks the same, regardless of whether or not you're getting the information from a dead person or a living person. So is it really worth running the money and time and effort to run this kind of a study? Probably not for us. Somebody else will probably pick it up. And if we were to do it, we probably wouldn't use EEG, because EEG is problematic, because if you speak during EEG, you generate a lot of artifacts which can confound your data. So we would probably do a study like this more with an fMRI. Okay, so so that was physiology. So does physiology help us get to the survival hypothesis or the nature of consciousness? In this context, at this time, we're not quite there yet. There's probably some more things to look at. But the other thing we have is phenomenology. And again, the phenomenology is the lived experience of the person doing the thing, right? So what is it that mediums experience? So this is interesting. In the early days of mediumship, back in the SPR days, the early SPR days, and the ASPR days, mediums, the mediumship process was much different. The mediums were in full trance, and they allowed a control to speak through them. And when the medium, when the event was over, the seance was over, they didn't often have full recollection of what had happened. However, that's not the case with modern American secular mental mediums. There is a slight altered state of consciousness that exists on a continuum, but they do not enter into a full trance like earlier mediums were reported to do, and they do maintain a level of awareness during and after the event, after the reading. So we learn that by looking at their phenomenology. And because of this change in their phenomenology, right, we can ask them about, well, we know that they communicate with discarnates, and we also know that they communicate with the living using psychic functioning. We can ask a brand new question. Can mediums tell the difference between somatic psi and survival psi? So we ran that study to look at it. And what we concluded was that the data suggests that the recurrents have the ability to differentiate between ostensible discarnate communication and the use of psi during psychic readings. We then reran that study again. This was Beischel and Rock and some other folks that were involved in this study, where we blinded the mediums and we compartmentalized them, and we had them both do both psychic readings and readings for readings for a sitter, discarnate, and they didn't know which was which. However, they were able to figure it out 74% of the time. So, and that's statistically significant. So under blinded conditions, it seems that mediums can tell the difference between somatic psi and survival psi. So where does that leave us? Well, phenomenology may end up giving us the answers to issues around the survival hypothesis and could help us eventually break this tie between survival psi and somatic psi. And in our opinion, they kind of already have, and it's a done issue, and we don't want to talk about it anymore. So there's a great presentation that Julie did called Living Agent Psi is Dead, and it's on the SSE's YouTube page. The SSE has a wonderful YouTube page. They put all their presentations up there from their conferences. It's awesome. But this will raise a number of new questions, right? So what experiments will need to be run to refute the data that support the existence of an afterlife? What is the level of data required to alter or change the position of someone who rejects the survival hypothesis? And now that we have some type of life after death, it's been established in some way, what will people do with that information? So, so where does all this leave us? So this brings us to application, and I'll just be super quick about this. So we have accurate information. We have the possibility of survival because we've broken the somatic versus survival psi stalemate. So can we actually use this information to help people? And so Larry Dossey, who is awesome, wrote this book called One Mind, which is awesome. Said, throughout human history, the terror of death's finality has caused more suffering than all the physical disease combined. And so every few years, Chapman University runs a study on people's fears. And in 2018, 56.4% of the people responding said that they were afraid or very afraid of the death of people that they loved. And there were about 30% of the people said they were afraid or very afraid of their own deaths. So why is fear of death relevant? Well, it negatively can impact end-of-life care decisions. It can result in unnecessary suffering. It can increase anxiety for both the dying and their families. So we became interested in this idea of how mediumship could help alleviate not only fear of death, but also traumatic grief. And so we ran a series of preliminary studies that we published in a journal called Omega. This was back in 14 and 15, and we're continuing more work on this now. And what we found in a retrospective survey is that, yes, when people got a mediumship reading, their level of grief did decrease. And we can't run statistics on this but bunch of technical reasons, like it's a retroactive study and you really shouldn't run stats on those. But you can see that there's a marked difference, a marked decline, reduction in their grief from the reading condition. The other condition is an MHP, or mental health provider. And you also see a reduction, but that reduction isn't as great. Now, this gets a little confounded because the people that went through the MHP is a little bit higher, but this is really promising and interesting data. What's even more interesting are the comments that people made in the survey that we gave them. So I'm just going to run through these quickly. I felt better after being with the medium. She stated things to me that were personal from my dad that no social worker could have done. The medium reached my heart, the social worker, my mind. When my first mental health provider negated the reading I had with a medium, I switched to someone who understood and supported my new reality and therefore received much more constructive help with my grief. The combination of assistance from an MHP and a medium is of significant value and in processing grief and corroborating one's belief in life and the other side, life on the other side. These are really powerful statements from people that are grieving and found some level of relief through the process of mediumship. So, can mediumship help people? Seems like it can. We need to do some more work on that. I'm not saying anyone who's grieving should go out and get a mediumship reading. There's information on our website that you should look at on winbridge.org if you're thinking about getting a mediumship reading. Again, I am not a healthcare provider and I am not recommending this as a general treatment for grief. So let's wrap this up. What do we know about
Mark? Yeah. Let's wrap this up. We have questions here.
I got one more slide. Okay, here we go. Here it is. So mediumship readings appear to involve 3 people and they all need to work together. Some mediums can report accurate and specific information about the deceased. We've broken the somatic side versus survival side debate. Mediums have a unique psychology. We didn't talk about this, but we've published on it. EEG show that the brain states of mediums may be different than in a medium state than other states. Surveys find that demonstrated that mediums have significantly higher instances of autoimmune diseases and significantly higher general disease burden than people who identify as non-mediums. Examining various components of a medium's blood, as well as other basic physiological measures, showed no changes were present when comparing a reading to a control condition. Preliminary research has demonstrated that receiving a mediumship reading may have a positive effect, a healing effect for grieving, and using fully blended protocols similar to that employed to test mediumship accuracy during readings of deceased people. Exploratory research has demonstrated that some mediums can report accurate and specific information about deceased companion animals. Please visit our website, winbridge.org. You can join our email list. You get access to all of our free educational materials. We do not have memberships or membership levels or any of that kind of stuff. Everything we produce is open access and open source. If you find it useful and would like to make a donation to support our work, that would be wonderful, not required. I am done.
All right. Thank you guys for waiting. We will be bringing Mark back up on stage for some questions. Mark, that was a wonderful piece. Thank you.
Hey, Justin. I don't think you and I have ever met. Have we met?
No, I don't believe so, but it's great to meet you now. Thanks.
Lovely to meet you as well. Thank you for the wonderful introduction and for hosting this session.
Yeah, just a moment. We have some questions coming in, but if you wanted to say anything post presentation, please do.
No, I think that was overly robust, that presentation. And it was a little specific to last year's conference. But beyond that, I'm willing to try to answer any questions.
Certainly. Well, we already have a few coming in, but I invite everyone to use the Q&A feature that Annalisa and Ramses described in the chat if you have any additional questions. So our first question is from John. He comments that he'd been impressed by the evolution of Discarnate's experience over the past few years, and he asked if you have a metric that measures sitters scoring the same Discarnates over years by various mediums.
It's an interesting question. No, we actually, and for a number of reasons, we actually don't support the idea of people getting multiple readings with the same discarnate over time. So this isn't anything that we would do specifically. I don't know if anybody else has taken that on.
Okay. Would you mind elaborating? Why don't you recommend that?
Well, a lot of it has to do with there's a couple of pieces. One, from our perspective, a mediumship reading is actually a therapeutic intervention, right? So you go, you get what you can from it, you hopefully have a positive experience, you integrate that, and then you move on, right? You don't need and to continue to do it could lead to things like addiction or not moving on with your life, or not allowing the discarnate to move on with their afterlife, right? So there's that piece. And also there's the issue of discarnate motivation, which also, once you've had a reading with a discarnate and the discarnate's told you all the things that they have to say, they probably don't need to come back over and over again.
Okay. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Thank you. All right, we actually have one from Annalisa.
Oh, she's tough.
Yes. Could you tell us a little bit about what you were presenting at this year's conference?
Oh, well, there's the stuff that I'm presenting, and then Julie has a short talk as well. The material I'm going to present has nothing to do with mediumship per se. It's I'm using artificial intelligence systems and machine learning systems to facilitate communication and interaction with non-corporeal consciousnesses, which may or may not include the deceased, but that's a bigger topic. Julie's got an interesting presentation. It's a short poster presentation about the relationship between mediumship accuracy and mindfulness practices. So I'm not going to give that story away, but that should be an interesting presentation. Did that answer your question?
All right. We have one from Dimitri. How often is information transmitted from the discarnate that was unknown to the sitter, but later proven to be accurate?
We don't have a specific metric on that. That's not something we've like tried to measure, but it's anecdotally that seems to happen fairly often.
No, understandable. I'd imagine it'd be challenging to pin down a specific metric on that.
Yeah, exactly how you would measure that and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of these like deeper level questions that are really interesting, and we would love to try to answer and push forward. But the bottom line is they're difficult to answer, and two, there's just the resources in this field are extremely limited, right? So any research we do has to be high impact, high level, what I consider to be high level and high impact, right? So while this is an interesting question, to me, that's sort of like, it's a little bit below and in the weeds for us. But maybe that's something like a grad student might want to take on or something like that. But
yeah. We'll message all the grad students in the chat, take some notes.
Yeah, go find some funding and do some mediumship research, and don't get thrown out of grad school for doing mediumship research in somebody else's lab, in somebody else's university, because good luck with that. All right.
All right. We have one from Michael. He believes that he might have missed a portion. He was curious what the difference between survival psi and somatic psi is. Would you mind clarifying?
Sure. Somatic psi is a term that Julie Beischel and Dr. Adam Rock coined, and it's specific about the psychic exchange of information between a medium and a discarnate. So, that's survival psi, right? So when a medium is getting information directly from a discarnate. When a medium is getting information from a sitter or some other living agent source, that's called somatic psi. And it was used to differentiate between this larger sort of living agent psi umbrella that people talk about in this research.
Sounds good. All right, from Paul, we have, would you mind discussing the possibility of the placebo effect of a person believing in mediumship due to your research as being influential in the therapeutic outcome?
Sure. Placebo effect is a real thing. We call it spontaneous healing. Yeah, I mean, if absolutely the role of belief is critical actually to a lot of clinical interventions, whether they be pharmaceutical or psychotherapeutic. Yeah, so I'm not sure. I'm not sure what specifically the question is, but is it possible that the placebo effect is taking place? Absolutely. Do I consider that a problem? Absolutely not.
Perfect. All right, from Steve, we have, to what do you attribute the drop-off of physical mediumship phenomena over the last 100 or so years? They mentioned that perhaps it might be our tech nowadays. One might think non-intrusive means for study are now prevalent. Not quite sure what the end there means, but what do you attribute to the drop-off of physical mediumship over the last 100 years?
Well, I don't know. Actually, I have no idea. It certainly has dropped off, but there are still pockets of physical mediumship taking place all around the world. It's not so much. It is a bit in the U.S., but it's much more prevalent outside the U.S. At least that's my impression. I don't know. It's time consuming, and I don't know. In terms of non-intrusive means to study, yes, the technology is getting better, but in my opinion, it's still not there. I started doing physical mediumship research, a number of years ago, and decided to put it on the shelf because in order to really answer the fundamental questions about physical mediumship, we would need to do things that would violate the requirements of the participants. And to me, as I talked about, we want to honor those requirements the best we can. And so until we have a better understanding of psychic functioning and how psychic phenomena manifest, and we have better ways to measure that, I personally am holding off on any more detailed empirical research on physical mediums. And I would suggest other researchers to do the same. I don't think it's I mentioned this earlier in a room. There's things about physical mediumship, for example, that require quiet environments, enclosed environments, personal space, those kinds of things. And then there's the requirements of materialist-based empirical research, right? And that is complete and utter transparency. Right. And those two things don't, in my opinion, necessarily sit comfortably together yet. So I would hold off on physical mediumship research, empirical physical mediumship research.
Good to know. I appreciate the insight there.
That is not a popular opinion, I might add. I am in the minority of researchers that feel that way.
Let's see. We have another question from Paul. It's, is there any difference that you can describe between discarnate animals versus humans?
No, the experience that, this is really interesting. The study of non-human animal discarnates, it was actually really difficult to do because of the deep emotional connection that many people have to their companion animals. And so providing readings for that population became really difficult because any error in mediumship readings have errors in them, right? They're not all 100% accurate all the time. Any minor error that might appear in a test reading was interpreted by the sitter as some sort of disconnect between them and their deceased companion animal, and they took it really hard. They were like, "Oh, I used to pet on the ears, but the medium said that they pet his, scratched his haunches. Did I do it wrong?" Right? Like, people are really upset about that kind of stuff. So we had to stop doing that research. But phenomenologically, in terms of the experience of the mediums, no. And I don't think there would be, right? There's more and more evidence to support the idea that in mainstream science about the existence of consciousness in a wide range of non-human animals. And if Psi and postmortem survival of consciousness is simply a function of consciousness, regardless of what body it lands in, then I would see all the same things that we would expect from non-human Psi interactions to apply to, from human Psi interactions to non-human Psi. It's very early here and I haven't had a lot of coffee. Okay, go ahead.
No, that's very interesting. Thank you. Let's see. We have a question from Robert. How do you see the complete automated approach to the afterlife? How do you see the completely automated approach to afterlife communication being used by Gary Schwartz?
I can't really speak to that project. I mean, I know that instrumental transcommunication and ITC has been used, has been around for a long time. People are using all kinds of technologies. There's a fundamental problem, however, with any sort of PK-based communication system, is that it's what we call the source of Psi problem. We don't know the source of the psychokinesis. So for example, if I'm using an environmental sensor or a random event generator and I'm interpreting those data as a communication from a discarnate, I can't really point a meter or something and say, oh, that effect definitely came from that consciousness over here and not the highly motivated consciousness of the operator or the experimenter or the person that spent decades of their career trying to prove a particular theory or spent thousands of dollars of their own money trying to promote a particular theory.
Yeah.
So
that makes sense.
So I think it's interesting. It's an interesting line of inquiry. Clearly, ITC, instrumental transcommunication, EVP, things like that. I think it's really interesting and really cool. It's still it's still very questionable as to how much that's all speaks to the afterlife and discarnate communication.
Okay. Well, Robert, thanks for the question. We have another one from Annalisa, this time coming from a YouTube viewer.
Oh, great.
Can you, right?
sorry, YouTube viewer. Sorry. I have bad experiences with social media and I'm so hi YouTube viewers. I'm so happy you're here.
The question is, can you recommend any researchers looking into high frequency ear ringing and clicking associated with Clara audience?
No, I can't. That's not an area I have any expertise in.
Okay.
I'm sorry. And that was a lovely question, by the way. Thank you.
Certainly, yeah. All right. Seeing if we have any more. It looks like we've answered most of them.
Woohoo.
We'll take this last one. Since mediums are doing phone readings, do you have any concern with hot readings? For instance, looking the person up on social media or anything like that.
Yeah, it's funny. Someone must have blogged about this recently. I have been fielding this question almost nonstop for like a month now, and it just keeps popping. We didn't hear about this at all, like before, like month and a half ago, and now it's like all up in my news feed and in my inbox. So the problem with things like this is just because you can imagine the possibility of doing it, you have to actually provide evidence that it happened or that it's even feasible. So sure, we're doing a phone reading. Here's what the medium hears when they do a phone reading. Hello, today you're going to do a reading for Karen. Please provide Karen's a physical description of Karen. Please provide a cause of death for Karen. Please describe Karen's personality. I would like to see anyone in this audience take that, and I'm thinking of a specific Karen, by the way, take that information that I just gave you and hot read that. But here's the thing. You have to show your work. You have to show what websites you went to. You have to show what tables you looked up to provide me with all that information. Because if you use any guessing or intuitive thinking, you're using Psi.
Yeah.
So you have to show that you were able to find that information using available resources. And I look forward to seeing people respond to that at some point in the future.
Yeah, no, great point. All right, we have Annalisa, it looks like, joining us. I guess we're wrapping up now.
Yes. Thank you for your talk, Mark. That was excellent. And I'm, of course, looking forward to all the things that you're doing and that we're doing together at the upcoming conference.
Oh, yeah, right. We have the climate change talk, too. I totally didn't mention that when you asked the question,
Yeah,
so I apologize.
That will also be very exciting.
Yeah.
So we are coming up on a break. We're actually a little ahead of schedule. So the networking break starts in about 7 minutes. I'm going to encourage that we all take maybe a quick bio break or something and then come back at 15 past the hour. This networking break, a few things going on. Mark has agreed to sit at a mediumship table to discuss any lingering questions that you might have. We also have individuals hosting tables from the Parapsychological Association, the Society for Scientific Exploration, from our sponsor, the Rhine Education Center, and also Public Parapsychology. For this networking break, I really highly encourage table hopping. These people are there to talk about their associations, to talk about membership, to answer your questions, hop around, get to know some of the people in the associations. Maybe there will probably be a couple other topical tables open. Get to know some attendees, but we don't require you to sit for the entire half hour wherever you end up. So do feel free to move around, and we hope that you will. So that will start in about 5 minutes, and it will end. If you can look at the top of your browser where it says view schedule, that's kind of what we're working with. So that'll end at 2:45 Eastern time. So about 30 minutes of a networking break, which again will begin in about 5 minutes. So thank you again, Mark. Thank you, Justin, for hosting, and we'll see you in the social lounge.
And thank you too. Take care.